Welcome, everybody, to episode 1 of The Musician's Musician. I'm your host, Nick Costa, and for those who don't know the concept here, I ask musicians I love to pick a musician that they love and an album that they love, and we just nerd out for a bit. Today, I talked with Kristopher Roe, who you might know as the frontman / lead singer / songwriter / main guy in general for the legendary pop-punk band The Ataris. I grew up listening to the Ataris. I actually joined my first band ever in 8th grade because a kid in my Spanish class saw my Converse All-Stars with flames on them and asked, "Do you like Sum 41?" And I said, "Yes." And then he said, "Do you like the Ataris?" And I pulled out my Discman and I showed him my copy of Blue Skies, Broken Hearts, Next 12 Exits. And then he asked if I played drums, and I just said yes, but I would have to use his kit. And that's a whole different story. Kristopher chose to talk about the Weakerthans and especially focus on the album Reconstruction Site. In this talk, we dive into the album, but we get sidetracked often. We dig pretty deep into his songwriting process. He shares some of his lyrics from the next couple of Ataris releases. We talk about the history of his music fandom. He was just so generous with his time. I could release an entire second part of this podcast just with the stuff I cut out. It was such a pleasure to chat with Kristopher, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Let's get into it. Great. Well, I am here with Kristopher Roe of the Ataris. Kristopher, thank you for being a musician's musician.
Very honored. This is a podcast that I feel is kind of built for me, being the big music nerd guy that I am. So I'm part of it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's one for us. So
yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to get into your pick. But before I get into that, you are doing some new music.
Yeah, the way the Ataris always worked generally in the studio was me and a drummer. So like the Ataris it's basically whatever I choose to record. It's like I put that name on it. But yeah, it's new Ataris music, correct? And so been in the studio recording new music for a while now, but I think it was basically in the last year or so that I feel like I just kind of got over this hump and like recorded a couple new songs. And it was like, oh, I can do this. Like, I remember how to do this. Like, I don't know what just kind of clicked, but then it just, from there, it just sort of steamrolled. And I've been in the studio every month. I just booked 3 more months of studio time. When I say month, like a couple weeks per month. I'm just like, just recording and documenting like any and every song that I have in my kind of like, I keep a playlist on my computer of like, all kinds of random fragmented ideas from dating as far back as the 90s to things I've written currently. And there's just finally came to a time where I feel like I'm making some great progress and I actually see like a kind of finish line in sight. So right now, and I hate putting dates on things, but right now I've kind of set a bar for myself where I've got studio time booked in January, February, and March. And the way it looks right now, as far as like the actual new recording of things, I'll probably finish with the recording in March. It might carry over to one more session in April because I'm still recording a lot of like new things. Yeah. And there will be a point where I'm like, okay, I've documented and recorded everything that I have that I want to record, like with the skeleton of each song, meaning like the drums and basic rhythm and bass. And then I will start going back to everything I've recorded recently and start, adding all the other bits and pieces and finishing them. I do have some complete finished songs. We will be releasing a 7-inch with 2 of those songs. Well, cool. 1 new song and then 1 surprise thing in the new year. I can't say when yet, but yeah, right. Early part of next year. And it's really special. I mentioned it one time on another podcast I did. It's really special because my dad, he was the biggest supporter of the band and always of my music and what I would create. And he passed away like 10 years ago this coming year. Thank you. Yeah. And to celebrate him, I always had this idea that like what a cooler way to celebrate him than to like make him a physical part of the music. I looked up, there really hadn't been any band that did this. I had seen a website where you could, for your family, make a small pressing of a vinyl with the ashes of someone in the vinyl.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, you know what? I would like to do that, but do it for our fans. The ones who knew him, he used to be on our message board. He would he would copy tapes, like VHS tapes of our shows and send them to fans. So I was like, I'm going to look into that. We found a company in Canada that would do it. We're going to do a small pressing, but one step further, we're going to get all the proceeds of the ashes variant are going to go to a charity that will help kids that grow up in families that are affected by addiction and alcoholism, because he died of renal failure that was related to his alcoholism. He got sober later in life and became a really wonderful human. But when I was young, he was an alcoholic, and he was an alcoholic his whole life, but he got sober. And so that's the first thing we'll be releasing. And hopefully by the end of March, I'll have an idea of where I'm at with all the other recording. And it looks like at this point, I have 2 to 3 records full of material, whether or not, what I'll do. I mean, I've recorded about 20 songs already. Some of those have vocals. Some of them don't have lyrics. I'm going to use a handful of those. That was like the first session for what we were calling the Graveyard of the Atlantic, which I'm probably not even going to use that title anymore because I've grown past it. And then recently I've recorded a bunch more songs, and in the next 3 sessions, I intend to record more. So I'll probably end up taking like 12 of what I feel are the strongest that I really want to be on a record, put those on a record, and then I'll have a bunch of other things that I will use for something the next record or some 7 inches. I don't know. But right now, the goal is hopefully finish recording in March, and then from there, we'll, start mixing and things like that. But I don't know. We'll see.
Well, that's very exciting, though.
Thank you.
Especially that it's so much music. Fans of yours, myself included, are going to be very excited. And you're doing that with Bob Hogue, right?
Yeah, Bob Hogue runs the studio in Arizona called Flying Blanket. And it's a really cool place because it's kind of like, speaking of like musicians, it's like a place that's like a very niche recording place. Like I know you were a fan of that band Margo in Indiana, but I think one of those guys, maybe because he was friends with their old bass player Brian, or some of those guys were, and I think they own a studio. They're the guys who run the studio that's in an old post office in Indiana, right?
Yes. Yep.
We rehearsed there once, and I love that studio. So there's some other studios like that are predominantly analog, and they're built in cool spaces. There's like Sonic Ranch in Texas. There's Jack White's studio, Third Man.
Yep.
Well, Flying Blanket is very much that kind of vibe, where it's built in this cool old mid-century modern style house space. And it's all, an old Neve console that used to be in the studio Fort Apache in Boston, where Pinkerton was recorded on that board. The Bends was mixed on that board. Julian Hatfield, Lemonheads, the Pixies. There's so many great records on that board. When the studio Fort Apache closed and those guys, Coldry and Slade, went and made their own home studios, they sold that Neve to my buddy Bob. And so that's the studio Flying Blanket is like just all 50s, 60s, and 70s analog gear, 2-inch tape. And that's how I've always recorded pretty much every Ataris record, is all analog. Yeah. And I just like the warmth of that feeling of like kind of natural, honest mistakes. I mean, we've talked about the Replacements a little, but that was like, I have this funny story about Paul Westerberg, because I chose to do Solo Astoria with Lou Giordano because he did Paul Westerberg's his solo album Eventually, I believe. And so he told me a story about Paul and how when he went to lunch one time, they had recorded something, and then Paul went to lunch and he came back and he was playing back the song they recorded, and he goes, "Hey, play it again." And he goes, "What happened to that mistake that was there?" And Lou goes, "I fixed it." He like cut the tape and fixed the mistake. He goes, "We made our whole career in those fucking mistakes. Put it back how it was." And he made him fix the splice, the edit in the tape. So to me, that is kind of like my mentality for recording. Like that honesty, that sort of like natural feeling of like that realness of recording that way is why I do it. But I'm not telling anybody to do it some way. I wouldn't I wouldn't buy a Kemper if you made me, but I have no disrespect to those things. Just like, I love the warmth of tubes, and that's just how I've always done things. Doesn't make it better. It just makes it how I do it. But,
I mean, if I had the ability to, record analog to tape, I feel like there is a lot of honesty in like the performance aspect of the recording that can really come through. I've driven people pretty crazy in the past because it's just like, no, I got it pretty good in 2 takes. I feel good about that one. They're like, well, you could like splice it or something. I'm like, it's fine. But
I'm very OCD, so trust me. I mean, even doing it the way I do it, I will just be like the guy where I'll be like, I don't know, man, I could do better with it. And Bob's like, no, it's great. I'm like, and we always end up being like, there was just a certain feeling to like the second take. And it's just like, it always seems like he knows me well enough, like my other set of ears, where he'll be like, trust me. So I just kind of, as I've gotten older, I've gotten a little bit better about just like giving up that control and just being like better about, there's a reason he and I work together. He plays drums on all the recordings, and I play all the guitars, the bass, and everything else. And
cool.
He's just a monster musician, and he plays like an old style drummer. He's more of those. He played drums in this band called Pollen that were like more of a band. That were kind of like all of the Descendants. In fact, they were one of the first bands to record at the Blasting Room, the Descendants studio, and they toured with them on the Everything Sucks album. But it was like, I think besides the Descendants, Pollen were the second band to record there. So if you're a fan of Pollen were very much like that. So Bob wrote all those songs, all the 90% of the melodies, the lyrics, everything, but he only played drums. And he would write all the guitar parts, transpose them from piano, left guitar, right guitar to the guitar players. And be like, all right, here's this. And so I always just thought he was really brilliant in that way. And so when we worked together, I mean, we all we're big nerds for Dinosaur Jr. and Sonic Youth and all these bands like that. But, we also grew up with punk rock. And so his style of drumming is more of that shuffly, like Keith Moon, like Mitch Mitchell, Ginger Baker, kind of, boom, 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 like very shuffly thing. And I like that because to me, like one of the biggest things I hate about modern punk rock, it just got just like, it's so, and the cookie cutter thing. It's like,
the same, like rock, it's like sample replaced drums that are hit as hard as you possibly can.
Dynamic.
And like, I don't know, the thing that drew me to punk rock as a kid was like the honesty behind it.
Me too.
Like the rawness and like I even feel like I have Endless Forever in the background here. I feel like that record, it sounds so good, but also just like so honest. And same with like, So Long Astoria, and So Long Astoria sounds, I actually was really surprised that was done analog because it sounds so good.
That was one where I believe we did some of the guitars and stuff to Pro Tools, but just for sake of the second studio we moved at for time, we were in like the B room or something, and but the drums and everything, we started out doing all to tape, and we still kept that like kind of the same. I always had the same kind of like, no matter how I'd record, I would always kind of do it the same way, regardless of the medium I'm recording on. Just like if I'm shooting a photo, it's like still me in my weird, quirky OCD way. It's like, okay, it's got to be like this, but I'm not going to let them auto-tune anything or really, cut something apart. And we try to keep it real. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could talk about the Ataris all day, but that's not why we're here. Let's get into your pick, which is the Weakerthans, is what we're going to be talking about. So we'll get into the album Reconstruction Site as well, but let's just talk about the Weakerthans just as a whole. When did you... This is one thing I'm kind of asking everybody, but when did you first discover, do you have do you remember the first time you heard the Weakerthans and were like, holy shit?
I remember being really, going back further, I was probably like 14, 15, and I remember me and my friend Mike Branch, who also named the Ataris, we drove 5 hours to St. Louis to see Propagandhi play this really tiny venue called the High Point, and they didn't even. They had one. I think they had that one record out. Then they had a 10-inch EP as well, the How to Clean Everything, and then they had the one EP. And so John K. Sampson from the Weakerthans was the bass player in that band, which is, when you listen to the Weakerthans, it's such a it's such a wild departure to have this like very soft spoken, beautifully poetic writer who was in this, really brilliant in their own right activist punk rock band that were also, big fans of like Corrosion Conformity and like Venom and hardcore and metal bands.
Yeah.
So, but I love all that. I came from the world where I loved Slayer, Rain and Blood, but I also loved Motown and jazz. And so I think that for me always shines in the music that speaks to me is you can hear that an artist or a writer has a very vast taste in what they listen to. And I think for me as a writer, it always makes my writing better to have a broader palette. But yeah, so for the Weakerthans, I think the first time I heard them, I forgot who it was, but some kid I knew had a like advanced cassette of their first album. I think it was Fallow, which I like that album, all right. But I feel like they really came into their own on Left and Leaving. It was like Fallow was like, all right, this is cool, but it's also like it didn't really strike me as much. But I remember on that album, he did like re-recorded versions of two songs that he did in Propaganda, and I felt like, oh, these make more sense. The song Anchorless, the version he recorded in the Weakerthans, I'm like, this is how this song with these tones, this makes sense. And it made me realize like, oh, this guy is just a really great songwriter in his own right. But it wasn't until Left and Leaving came out where I was like, man, like his lyrics, they're just really in a league of their own. Like to me, there were a handful of these writers that we briefly spoke about in email, like, Blake from Jawbreaker is always one, like when you listen to 24-Hour Revenge Therapy or Dear You, and you just hear how poetic the lyrics are. In that world of music at that time, there weren't a lot of other artists that were really writing like that.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
That's kind of what spoke to me. And then you had Pedro the Lion, like David Bazan, like Tim Kasher from Cursive and The Good Life.
Yep.
Like I think that first and second Rilo Kiley album, the lyrics were really incredible. There's like a handful of those. But yeah, it was really cool. And I think, and then when Reconstruction Site came out, it was like, holy hell, this album is like one of the most like beautifully written albums I've heard in like modern music, as far as like lyrically, like specifically. It's a great album when you put it on, and I don't skip a track. But from a lyrical standpoint, it's like such a high bar that like I love when I hear an album and I'm just like, I quit. Fuck. There are those albums that come along where I'm just like, man, like I love this so much I hate it because it just makes me frustrated that I am like, I feel like it pushes me to write better, and it makes me feel like, how can I write something of that caliber? And that's what good art does. I think it makes you feel like, all right, I've got to go back to the drawing board and just like continue to push myself harder. Like what I do, I feel I'm proud of, but we can always continue to like better ourselves in our craft. And I mean, if you're not continuing to grow and get better and push yourself to be a better writer or guitar player or whatever, and you plateau and you're not growing, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. To me, that's like, that's one of the bigger travesties for musicians. I like when somebody continues to create and they have a great sound and they do that thing. But it's also cool to see those artists that, go from writing like the Blue Album to writing Pinkerton, or writing like, OK Computer, and then continuing to like writing In Rainbows. And then like every album, it's like, holy hell, this band continues reinventing the wheel. Like there would be no Dark Side of the Moon if that band did not go from, we're going to continue to evolve. But But yeah, the Weakerthans were a band, and then then they put out one other record after that, and then they decided to just not play anymore, or go on hiatus, and I think that's even more brilliant. But I think you'll talk to a lot of, at least I know a lot of bands that I know that like, if you mention this record, there's a lot of people that won't even never heard of this band, or they haven't heard of this record, and I'm like, have to listen to this record, especially if you're a songwriter, because it's really a high bar for
John K. Sampson, who is the kind of main writer for the Weakerthans, and an incredible solo artist in his own right. He has a real knack for kind of blending like intense poetic imagery with like kind of plain speak. So it's like,
yes.
it's so approachable, and it's so, it has a way of just like gutting you in a way where you're just like, I have never been in this situation personally, but I feel it to my core.
When I was listening earlier, I think that like you nailed it when you were talking about like plain speak. The one thing that I really feel when I listen to a lot of the songs, and when I was going through some of the lyrics of like Reconstruction Site and Left and Leaving album, he has this way of taking really mundane objects and somehow making them like this eloquent, like vivid image in a song. Like the song, there's several, I'll mention it, like a few, like, oh my goodness, the song Utilities, which was there's this really great solo version he did on like Canadian Broadcasting that I remember I like ripped from YouTube and I listened to forever. And then because I heard him play it live when I saw them play at the Garage Shop in Cleveland, and then he recorded it for the album. But I just feel there was a certain integrity to that like solo version he did. But the whole song is basically him just like name checking, like the feeling. It's really hard for me to like break apart somebody else's song because I'm only going with my interpretation. But like it feels like a very melancholy thing of like that feeling. Like the first line is like, I got this feeling that today doesn't like me, and it's like you get this like imagery, like you said in the scene of like the feeling he's going through. But then he goes on and he just talks about all these objects, like really, really minimalist objects. Like, one line is like, we can wish on the pop of a light bulb, or these photos lying yellowed and curled, loose in boxes near abandoned electronics in the corners of the basements of the world. It's like, how do you take these little scenes and somehow make it do something that like makes the hair on my arm stand up?
Yeah, it's such a unique voice too. Not like an actual singing voice. Like his singing voice is very unique, but like
100%, yeah.
His tone in his writing, you can hear a John K. Samson lyric and kind of, if you're familiar enough with him, know that that's from him.
It's very telltale.
Yeah.
And like you said, his voice, I mean, his actual voice too. It's I tend to gravitate towards those artists that have kind of character voices or don't sound like anyone else. I mean, if you go back through even punk rock, or you go through like, people who are actual, like more well-versed singers, I suppose. The ones that stand out for me are not those ones that can actually just like sing perfectly. It's the ones that sound like themselves, like there's one of you. And, this is for me, one of the things that made me, when I first heard this band, I was like, he's got this, it's almost a very like ornate kind of like, I don't want to say something that sounds like a diss, but it's not. I mean, he's got this very almost kind of flawed voice and the best ways. And I think that's what's great to me about so many singers. Like if you listen to Jay Mascis and Dinosaur Jr., I don't think you ever hear anybody say, man, he's the greatest singer. He sounds like no one else. And he's got this very like mumbly, and that's Jay, but it's fucking awesome. And it's perfect. And it fits for that band. And there's no one like it. And that's what I feel. This band is really cool. The Weakerthans were cool, and John K. Samson's voice is great because it's like it's one of a kind.
Agreed.
That's cool.
Yeah, agreed. I remember it was like a Hopelessly Devoted to You compilation.
Yeah.
And a side was on there.
I love that song.
Which is like just an unreal song. But I remember being, like a teenager, and I got that, because I think probably like Thrice and, there's a couple of those bands were on there, and I was like, yeah, I've been to Warped Tour. And I remember hearing that song and being like, I don't know actually what to think about this, because this feels different. Like it belongs, but it also stands like away from kind of everything else there. And that whole album kind of has that vibe.
I think that was what was cool about like compilations like that in general, is like, that there would sometimes be these gateway artists for people. And I had that in my own, going back, I remember there were bands where I would see them wear a T-shirt of an artist, and I'd be like, oh, I'm going to check that out. But there were definitely compilations that I would buy. I think my first punk rock album I ever bought was the artist Pusshead, who would draw, all the like Zorlak skateboard shirts for like Metallica and all the like really great artist. He played in like this kind of like crust hardcore band as well called Septic Death. And he did this compilation called Cleanse the Bacteria, which had like 7 seconds, and Poison Idea, and then a bunch of like European bands. And I remember getting this at like 11. I bought it because I remember I loved that artist's art. And I was like, wow, the picture had this guy like in like a swamp with a bunch of sewage, and it was like this weird creature, and it had like this typical Zorlak. If you don't know what Zorlak is, it's Zorlac for people that would see this. It's he did all that really great art for all those old 80s skateboard decks, and also for Metallica and some other artists. And but yeah, I bought that compilation, and then I discovered that was kind of my gateway into punk rock. And then through that, I remember trading my mom's cordless telephone while she was sleeping for very unbeknownst to her, for a Black Flag cassette of the first 4 years era, and a Minor Threat Out of Step cassette. And she woke up and she's like, Chris, where's my telephone? And I was like, oh shit. And I felt so bad, but I was also like, thanks. She was pretty understanding. But yeah, that's those comps, Hopelessly Devoted. Yeah, Hopeless were good. I think they were one of those labels, like be it Epitaph or some other labels like that were good about having some artists that weren't just in that punk rock box. And you had some that had that niche sound. Like I think if you think of Fat, they definitely had a thing. But Epitaph, they went on and they started Anti, and they had signed like Tom Waits, and then they signed the Weakerthans too. They put out their records later. Yep. But I like when these punk rock labels, obviously they have people that are there, like probably Brett from Bad Religion, that have this taste like you and I, that's beyond that, and they want to give a window to those artists. So I think Lucero are one I always think of too, because they were on like a Warped Tour comp and some other things, and I loved that band for ages. And then I remember that was kind of the thing. I think that song Bike Riders was on a comp, and I was like, man, good for them. Like it just kind of what they'd already built just like steamrolled. I think that was a big compilations helped. San Dimas was on the Fat Records comp, and that was the thing that launched our band. I mean, we already had a record out. Nobody knew who the hell we were. And then we were out playing shows. And during that tour, I remember we'd suddenly see people. We started the tour playing for 5 people. And then we played a few shows on the Fat Records tour with like, I forgot, he was Good Riddance and we no use for name. And there'd be like, oh, we played San Dimas, and we noticed people know the words. Like, how do they know the words? I'm like, oh, it's that Fat Music comp that they give out with mail order for free. And then when we put out Blue Skies the following year, that was in the fall, and the San Dimas was on that comp. And the following year, that was the thing that kind of launched the Blue Skies album. But anyway, back to the Weakerthans. Yes, I like to give long diatribe answers. I'm so sorry.
No. That's why this is a podcast. It was at this point that Kristopher had to plug in his phone, but when he came back, we started talking about Minneapolis, and this is what came next.
But Minneapolis music, that's my town. Like, there's so much great music came from there. Be it like Husker Du, Old Soul Asylum, and The Replacements are one of my all-time favorite rock. So,
I mentioned briefly, but First Ave puts on like Replacements tribute shows, and so
you're right. You played one of those, you said.
I did a couple.
Killer.
It was like such an honor, because like it's First Ave and they're asking you to do these things. And,
when I played that place, and I was like, I can't believe I'm playing here.
And it's like every time I played there a bit, and like it was so surreal growing up in Minneapolis and like going to shows there, and like I probably saw you guys at like the Quest. But
I remember that place too,
which is gone now.
Yeah, that was. It
was like Prince's. He like started that venue, I think.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was his place. Yeah, I think they told me that when I played there. I was like, I had no idea. Yeah, there were a few venues that kind of came and went there. There was that place. Wasn't there like Caboose or something?
The Caboose, yeah.
I didn't like that place that much. No offense.
Not my favorite.
I love First Avenue and then the Entry were just always great. And then there were some like DIY spaces like long before that we played. Before we could, in the 90s and very, very early 2000s. But I forgot some of the names of the places, but there were some really good ones. But because we were my buddy Mark Dean, who was our roadie, was from there. And then my buddy Ian ran this Drinking with Ian site that was like, he grew up in Indiana, and he was, and so I had two good friends from there, and they were friends with like all those local bands like Lifter Polar and Selby Tigers and then Sean Spillman and all those, like who went on and did like Sha Na Na and like, Harmar Superstar. So we were like, we'd go there and play, and we were just like a little punk rock band. And we'd, had our nerdy indie rock merch guy and all, all these people. And so he'd always be turning us on all these great Minneapolis bands. And it was such a great music scene. And even beyond the like bands that people know, but yeah, I mean, I love those early Soul Asylum records, and then Prince, but and then Husker Du. That was Sugar Copper Blue was beyond the Paul Westerberg thing. That was the real reason I chose Lou Giordano, because I thought Copper Blue and like Bob Mould's solo band Sugar was like the most like. I remember that being just one of the most like even, solid sounding records in the '90s, and I loved it. It was like right there with like Matthew Sweet and all those other like great like '90s big power pop records, and I was like, God, this is so fucking good. Yeah. And so we went with Lou, and he did Sam I Am Clumsy, and but yeah, he had a lot of great Westerberg stories, and he toured as Husker Du sound engineer for a while, and on their last tours, and he was really, he's a great guy. Yeah. And but anyway, back to
we can dive back in. Yeah, but let's touch on Reconstruction Site. Reconstruction Site was the third album from them. It got a 5.6 on Pitchfork, which means that's how you know it's good. They called it. They said that it would make finely catchy radio signals for fans of faux Weezer geek rock, which I think is actually pretty accurate.
I don't hear the Weezer thing, but I mean, a geek rock, definitely. I guess I could see that.
There was like one song where I was like, I guess I could see it, but there was actually was Uncorrected Proofs was a song
that's a great lyric in that song.
Yeah, the lyrics are so good. The chorus melody it gave me chills, and then
phenomenal.
Yeah, and the instrumentation and the production actually kind of reminded me, and I know it came out the same year as So Long Astoria, but it felt similar as far as how it hits and like how it doesn't, it feels like, of the genre adjacent, but not necessarily in there. That's
great compliment. Yeah, I was very much listening to this album at the time.
I was going to ask.
I feel this album's probably a bit more like I hadn't quite yet refined. Like I like nowadays, I feel my guitar sound live and in the studio, I use a 1964 Bassman amp, and sometimes I'll use my amp I use live, it's like a 1979 Orange or 80. And back then, I loved like old amp sounds and things that were a little more not cleaner, but just more. Not just cleaner, but more clarity. And it can be driven. When you put two guitars together that have, that aren't just super blown out. If you get a lot of like grip and gain. Yeah. Like these guitars have on Reconstruction Site, and it still sounds punchy and it still sounds like a rock album, but it just doesn't sound muddy. Like a lot of punk rock albums you listen to, especially at that time, the guitars, like, you have one guitar sound and it's already like super driven, and you put another with it and it just sounds, you don't hear the string clarity, you don't hear the notes. Well, this album, Reconstruction Site, I really loved how kind of almost had like a more folky indie kind of clarity to the production, but it was still had these like gritty kind of like, almost punky punk rock kind of, power pop kind of hooks and choruses. Yeah. So it really straddled that line. Whereas So Long Astoria, I don't think I was quite good at doing that yet, but that was the album where I always say that I learned how to finesse my songwriting working with Lou Giordano, and I really learned peaks and valleys and the importance of a big chorus that comes in and to drop the verse. And really, when I wrote like San Dimas, like there's no structure to that song. I couldn't write that today if I tried. There's no chorus, but it works somehow.
It does.
I feel there's something beautiful about writing and you don't think about it, and it just comes out and doesn't make sense on paper. But I also feel like, working with somebody like Lou Giordano made me appreciate like, oh, okay, there is a craft to writing a song. And if you look at all the folk songs like Dylan wrote, or, Tom Waits wrote, or there's all kinds of songs that go off on cool tangents. And, like Dylan, he's the king of having 64 verses in a song, and somehow I'm like still enthralled.
Yes.
And there's still a story and there's still a narrative. But yeah, Reconstruction Site, I feel like it taught me some things, and I definitely took away like, man, sonically, it's still driving, and it still just has this like really powerful feeling, but it's not completely overblown or driven. And the guitars, they sound more like what I yearn for in like guitar world. And I feel like that's kind of what I ended up, not just this album, but in general, like there were a lot of other albums I listened to there were rock albums, but they had a more defined, clear guitar sound that wasn't super like distorted. And so then I found my orange amp when we were playing a show on the East Coast. Like I used it at a shop, and I played it, and I'm like, this is what I've been looking for. And then after that, I used to own this JCM 800 Marshall that was Blake's, and Blake from Jawbreaker bought it from Ian MacKay when they had an amp break, I guess, on a tour on the East Coast, and it was Ian's practice amp, I've been told, in Fugazi. Cool. So it was an heirloom of an amp, and I bought it from my buddy Dave Ehrlich, who played in this nerd rock band Nerf Herder, and was
sure.
Guy. And so Dave sold it to me, and I used that amp on almost every record the Ataris made in some fashion. I would change up amp sounds. I'm always a fan of doing different guitar sounds for a bunch of songs and having variety. But that was at least featured on every album. And then after Song of Story, I was like, you know what? I want this amp to like keep growing and moving, and it deserves to like keep living. And so Jerry Finn, the producer, bought it from me in an auction off of eBay. He's like, can you stop your auction now? I used that amp when I was recording Jawbreaker Dear You, and it's the best sounding Marshall I've ever heard. It was like a 1980 JCM 800. And I'm like, yeah. So I sold it to him for $3,000, and he continued to use it. And then he unfortunately passed really young with I think a brain aneurysm.
Yeah,
and then
he rest in peace.
Yeah, he's a really, I never got to really know him, but he produced Smoking Post, Destination Failure, Super Drag, Head Trip in Every Key, Dear You, three albums that are sonically some of my favorite albums.
Yeah, he produced what was a turning point for me. I'm a bit younger, but Enema of the State. Blink-182, I think for a lot of people who are of a certain age, that was the one.
Like AFI and those bands. I didn't really listen to those bands, but I do feel like he did a Cure album, he did a Morrissey album. So he's one of those producers that for every walk of life, for every age group, there was some record in your collection that him and like Rob Cavallo did. He worked with, I mean, if I'm not correct, he worked with Rob Cavallo on Dookie?
I think he engineered, and I think he mixed a couple of songs.
So motherfuck, like that is like, what a resume.
Yeah.
And then and
he ended up with that amp, which is so cool.
Yeah, and he ended up with the amp which he had already used, which is the Circle of Life, and then an even bigger Circle of Life is that Adam, friend and drummer of Jawbreaker, bought it from the estate of Jerry Finn, and now Blake used it in all the reunion shows when Jawbreaker got back together. So I remember standing on stage, on the side of the stage at Riot Fest, at their first show back. Right there is my amp, and I remember seeing it. I'm like, it's so fucking wild, because you could see, like, I had Blake sign it at a Jets of Brazil show, and he just signed it real big, and I grayed it out so it didn't. You could tell if you went up to it. I went over it because he signed it in white marker, and I remember I didn't want it to say Blake real big. I just wanted it to be faint, and so I could still see him. Like, that's so fucking weird, but that's my amp, and it was his amp, and then it was my amp, and so that amp, I'm glad that it goes on living, and it's cool. But yeah, sonically, this Reconstruction Site, I think it was a phenomenal album. Ultimately, I think the thing for the Weakerthans that makes me choose them the most is like just lyrically. I mean, these songs. There were a lot of records I told you that I love. My all-time favorite record, like My Bloody Valentine, Loveless, or like the recent Cigarettes After Sex last 3 albums, I love.
So good.
But those are more about a feeling, and they're more about a vibe. I put them on, and I couldn't tell you one lyric of Loveless till this day, because it's like an instrument in the music.
Yes.
But
it's almost like a Sigur Rós album. Like you're...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, they're even one further. Like, they create words.
They're not even real.
Yeah, they said they created like a language for some of those early records, which is, but yeah, great band too. But But yeah, this album specifically, I feel is like a lyrical high point. And it's songs that I just feel are phenomenal as songs. But if I may, there's one song in particular, but it's actually on the previous album that I wanted to mention the lyric.
Let's get into it. Yeah.
It just crushes me every time I hear it. But again, it's hard to pick apart somebody else's song. But what I gather from this song, hold on, I'm trying to find it. The song "Exiles Among You" on "Left and Leaving" is like, yeah. There's a line at the end where he's kind of just, I guess to make it impactful, I kind of got to set up the song. But he's like the character in the song is talking about like. It says her body is a difficult sister and she loves her. So I'm gathering he's talking about a sister of the person. But anyway, at the end of the song, the great part of for me, like the payoff of the whole song, it's like yeah. So rather than like calling home, phoning home to the sister or whatever, like she sits there and does this instead. So it's like the person in the song. It's like she shoplifts some Christmas gifts and a bracelet for herself, and considers phoning home, has some quarters in her hand, but she sits down on the sidewalk and bites her bottom lip and spends the afternoon willing traffic lights to change. Like, who the fuck writes that? Like,
yeah, it's
like, dude, there's such like sadness and beauty in that is just like, it crushes me, because it's like, you feel the hope in the line of like, she's right there, she's about to call home, and again, it's all interpretation, but to me it's like this person is like missing out of the life of the other sibling maybe, and they're considering reaching out, but instead is like the dreamer, the kind of like vagabond, drifter, whatever that they are, they instead sit down and do this beautiful thing where they spend the afternoon willing traffic lights to change. Like something I remember like sitting there as a kid and like looking at the traffic light and you're like, okay, it's just like, who writes that? It's so, but that is, to me, a good like metaphor for all of John's lyrics. I mean, he just can take these little situations and just somehow make it so eloquent. And I try to strive for that in this new song that we're going to be releasing on the first 7-inch. I feel in some of these new songs, and starting with So Long a Story, like I feel I started to kind of get better at doing that and really become a better vivid storyteller and focus more on narratives. But there's some lyrics in that, if I may, I'll tell you. There's one line in the second verse specifically, because the song it's written. I wanted to write it from a perspective where the listener will hear it, but you may think I'm singing about a person, but I'm really singing about all of the adventures and the things I saw driving around the country in North America in my first car that I bought with my own money, which was a 2003 Dodge Neon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this car went to Canada, North America, all over the States. I drove it all over on multiple tours and had so many adventures until finally the car, there was a lady who slammed on her brakes in traffic in Indianapolis. Traffic came to a halt, and there was this giant, like one of those like construction signs with the message on them. And I could have slammed into her and hit her, or I swerved off and I hit that and peeled back the top of the car like a sardine can. And I remember walking away without a single shard of glass. I felt like Jules in Pulp Fiction, like, did God come down and stop the bullets? It was fucking wild.
Yeah.
But so the song basically starts off as me seeing the car in a junkyard with like flowers springing up out of its body where it now rests. It's like the first line in the song is like, now you rest amongst the rust of these roadside monuments. So it's basically setting up like, now this car is in this junkyard and its new graveyard, its home where it rests. And in all these former glories, the drive-in nights that came and went, we fought on hard through rain-beaten nights, past the shadows of state lines. Now this victory dance, it belongs to you and I. So it's me setting it up. And then, but the verse I'm really proud of, which is where I tried to write some of my father into it and why I chose it to be on this 7-inch tribute to my father, is he spent his 32 years working at the automobile factory, making GM cars. Biggest automobile factory outside of Detroit was in my town, Anderson, Indiana, until they, all the jobs left in the 90s and the last couple thousand were gone in early 2000s. But But there's a line, the second verse is me kind of describing when I went back, kind of like what I did in So Long Stories. I went back to my town I grew up, and I remember seeing it for the first time in a long time. And this was mid 2000s. I think I wrote this line. And I remember driving past the area where my father's factory once stood and just seeing, you know, like where the car rests now, it's like full circle. It's like, you know, these, they would make automobiles like the one that I had all these great memories in. Now this factory where that car was, you know, many of those cars were made is now a graveyard and just a field and the rest of my town looks like, you know, it's this very totalitarian Eastern European vibe in the Midwest now, where you have all these boarded up factories and everything just looks like what you would imagine. It's very cold, very gray, very drab. So it was a winter day, and I remember, so I wrote this line. It says, the winter sky is weeping, the factories lie in their graves, like Cold War artifacts marching in some ghost parade. We watched these streets of fire fall and crumble into the sea. Now, darling, won't you come on home to me? And so, yeah, that's the line, just kind of describing those factories and the full circle of the car.
That's so cool. And thanks. I mean, the lyrics are fantastic. You've always been a very good lyricist, but I
appreciate it. I'll take it, but you know, I feel I have my strong points, but there's, you know, I'm getting better. So that's the thing to me, is as long as I feel like I'm improving, it's good. It's always the thing where, like I said, as long as you don't feel like, you know, something you did previously it is like you're getting worse, or, you know, but thank you.
No, I hear what you're saying, though, as far as, you know, kind of taking how John K. Samson kind of takes his songs, and there's like, you know, I feel like a lot of your previous lyrics were like pretty, not to go back to what we were kind of saying before, but a little bit more plain spoken.
Yeah, especially like the relation. I feel I have like the songs that are very relationship based, or like personal stories like that. Mm-hmm. Or I have like a song, like the saddest song I wrote about having a daughter and relating that to how my father wasn't in my life for many years, mm-hmm. and how he came back into my life. Or like I have those songs that I feel are a little bit more straightforward or surface, and I try to have some more depth and vivid narratives in the verses, but then I like to have a big chorus hook too. I'm a fan of having something you can sing, because like, as much as I love Springsteen, you know, like I feel like he is also great about, in a lot of songs, having a good singable chorus hook, because you can't sing something that's super wordy and doesn't repeat as well, and I want to have that. So, you know, even a song like My Reply, which was about somebody who wrote me a letter from the hospital telling how she was going through eating disorder, and she struggled with like, you know, suicide and some other things like that. And I feel like I wanted to write this as a for line response, at least the verse, to her letter, so she knows it's for her, but write it in a way that's broad enough to where other people can relate to it. So yes, definitely songs like that. But then, you know, I feel I had songs like Fast Times at Dropout High, or like So Long Astoria, which I feel are more akin to what I write now. Yeah. And there are those, but yeah, you don't just go from A to that overnight. Right, you really, I think the So Long Astoria album and working with Lou Giordano was when I realized, like, okay, what songs am I most proud of what I've written, and what do I feel I do the strongest? And I felt like songs like So Long Astoria, like Unopened Letter to the World, like those songs are the ones to me that I still feel like lyrically really hold up. Like In This Diary, I think it's a great song that really holds up, but it also is kind of the middle ground between what I was saying with this more straightforward songs in the chorus, but it has a strong narrative in the verse. So yes, yeah, it's just all about finding balance. And, you know, they're not all on all these new songs I've written. They're not all this wordy and poetic. I wish they were, but I mean, you know, there's definitely some more straightforward ones.
You got to do it. You got to do it sometimes.
But it's not, but it's ones that just came out naturally. Like I one new tune, I woke up from sleep and I just remember having this melody in my head. And I, you know, remember seeing, like, it was a really beautiful scene of, you know, the morning. You get a really good golden hour coming through this room in my apartment, and it was just really like a beautiful yellow golden hour in the morning. And I just remember seeing it, and I was like, had this full complete verse, chorus, melody come to my mind, and this kind of, and I just like, okay, I better jot this down. So I just hummed it into my phone, and that song ended up, we recorded it, and it ended up being this like super fast kind of like Descendancy, all kind of punk rock song. And it was something like, I didn't think I would write a song like this again, but it literally was a complete thought. And I'm like, Bob, should I record this? I mean, he's like, yeah, it's fun, it's cool. And I think, you know, that's a little more straightforward lyrically, but it still fits. If you don't want every song on a record to be the same thing, for me, I like to have some peaks and valleys there too. And so,
well,
there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, even with the Weakerthans, like there are those songs on, if you listen to Reconstruction Site, one cool thing I think stands out is like there are songs that really differentiate from each other. There's the one song that everybody gravitates to, this that plea from a cat named Virtue, where he writes the whole song in the perspective of the cat,
which
observing
is so good.
The owners.
Yeah, I love that perspective and like and that kind of shift. And it almost adds like there's still a big heaviness to that song, but like finding out that it's from the perspective of a cat also at the same time adds like this layer of levity that is kind of necessary on an album that's just like so heavily talking about mortality.
Sure. It even starts out like with like the opening and closing, because it's almost like it's kind
of a concept album.
Exactly.
Sort of. Yeah.
Because you have the opening and the middle and the end are all those little short kind of like link tracks. Hospital Vespers,
Manifest, and Past Due.
Manifest. And so he's writing, looking over the person, his friend, or in the hospital room, and it's like going through the artifacts that his friend, you know, that he got from his friend's house who's dying or something. Like, it is. There is a lot of mortality in this album, and where it strikes such a great balance of being an album that is kind of lighthearted in places, but in a way where just enough to where like a great film that strikes a balance of being sadness and comedy. It's like comedy and tragedy, really just perfect balance of that. And it just shows that like as a human, and in the times I've met him, he's just such a sweet dude. Even when I met him the first time in that Propaganda show, I just remember him being really generous. And he had like a McDonald's McDeath button, because they were very always outspokenly a vegan band.
Sure, yeah.
And I wasn't at the time, but I thought it was really great as a kid. And he just like took it off its strap and gave it to me. It was such a sweetheart.
Oh, that's
and I remember
cool.
seeing him years later when like it was like Lucero and the Weakerthans and I forgot who else played that show in like Philadelphia when I was on tour. And he just somehow randomly remembered me. He goes, "Hey, Chris." I'm like, "How do you know who I am?" It was really cool. I was just like, "Oh man."
Yeah.
And like if you only knew, I'm like a super big nerd for your music. But but yeah, I think that really shows when you see somebody who's a really kind and generous human, but you know doesn't take themselves too seriously. I guess I was trying to say is that like sometimes that shows in the music, and it's good when you have somebody that's such a so good at writing these like brilliant narratives and these songs that seem so deep. But then, there's still this level of like just kind of kindness and not so seriousness of it. Because to me, like it can come across pretentious really easy when an artist is really fucking good, but they also are just like, I'm cool. Really take themselves seriously. And I won't mention bands, but there's one artist specifically where I think they're really damn good, but I just never could get into songs for that reason, because I'm like, these songs are great, but it just seems like a couple come to mind. A couple like seems like they just take themselves too seriously. Like I'm the first one. Like I will never give myself a fucking compliment. I'm happy to take it, and I'm getting better at that. But like, man, like I can't stand pretentiousness. It's just such a turnoff for me.
What's the point?
Just humble, man. Yeah, exactly. What's the point? Like,
what is that doing for you? I also noticed that the album features another songwriter by the name of Sarah Harmer, who's another Canadian. And they did some. She does the backups on I think on a handful of songs, right? Yeah. Have you ever listened to her music?
Yeah, I went down a rabbit hole one time because they backed up another Canadian artist. I forgot where they were his backing band around the time in between Reconstruction Site and the follow-up album. Civil Tour. Twilight, right? And then I looked into her songs as well because she played with them live at those shows they recorded in Canada, and I thought her songs were really great too.
Yeah, so, yeah. She has an album called "I'm a Mountain" that my partner introduced me to.
That's right.
And like that album is unbelievable. There's a song called "Oleander," where if
I think I downloaded that record right there around the time. I'll go back and listen to it now.
It is unreal.
Like you were saying, like there are these like artists that sort of gateway you into things, into other artists, and I'm like you. I definitely, when somebody's featuring an album or is a part of a writing on an album, or I like to like look further into that artist as well, because it's like, well, if this group of individuals who I respect and admire their writing are kind of vouching for this other great writer, I imagine they've got to be great. And I also discovered a lot of people that way because, somebody was a part of a project where I'm like, that's great, and I kind of, I respect that when artists like kind of use what they do to kind of help people discover other artists that they feel, are great in their music scene or equally amazing writers. So that is really cool.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that this album is, this album and this band are a really great kind of just like gateway to a lot of different styles of music, especially if you are somebody who was kind of raised with punk rock or something like that. It's nice because it goes across so many different genres, even in the same album. While
there are those albums that do that I feel are. If you ask any person from an indie rock world or a punk rock world, I think there's certain albums that they will agree on that both walks of life will say is something they love or is in their collection. And I think this is probably one of my, I definitely recall multiple like punk rock dudes that I know that probably don't listen to some of the like, sad bastard snobby indie shit that I listen to or whatever, that they do love this album. And I'm like, well, if you like that, you should definitely check this out. And so, I agree that this album, it definitely bridges the gap between those two genres for sure. Like folk and Americana as well as like indie rock stuff. And it fits just as much. I think it fits alongside great, smarter punk rock albums as well. If you listen, if you're a fan of the Menzingers or Against Me or, Gaslight Anthem or those bands that kind of, I feel, are doing it right, that are coming from that world of like, Jawbreaker and that kind of stuff that was a little bit more, literary and a little bit more book smart, but also not so just, everything's punk rock song, but it's, punk rock for nerds who also read books.
Yeah, definitely.
Or like poetry or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, I think that is a good stopping point. But
cool. Hope we didn't talk too much diatribes about other stuff.
No, it was.
I'm glad we could. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was so fun. And I also just wanted to say that just a short little story and thank you.
Sure.
There was a time, I think it was probably like 2004 or 5 at the Warped Tour. I was a kid. My aunt worked for Columbia Records, and
oh wow,
and she got us backstage passes to Warped Tour.
In Minneapolis, or where?
It was at the Somerset Amphitheater, Somerset, Wisconsin.
Where the big thing happens every year, the Summerfest.
Yes,
every year.
Summerfest happens there.
Yes, yep. I know that well. Yeah.
Yep. So Warped Tour was there that year. I had a guitar with me, and I was just having everybody sign it, and I remember Rancid was playing and you were side stage, and I didn't dare go up, but I was like, kind of standing there with my guitar, and you looked over and you saw me and I kind of waved at you and you came down and you were like, hey man, what's with the guitar? And I was like, I'm having people sign it. Will you sign my guitar? And you're like, that's so cool. Of course. And like, you talked with me for a little bit, and that was like such a kind moment. And like, I had met other people that day who like barely wanted to give me the time of day, but like that meant so much to me, even as a kid and even today. And so I just wanted to say thank you for just being
I appreciate
so
that.
kind.
Thanks. Well, it means a lot. Thank you for saying, remembering that moment from that long ago, and so much. I'm honored that you it had that impact, and you would bring it up today. Thanks.
Yeah,
and it makes me think there's a lot of artists that did that for me, and for me it was always just like, I think my mantra was always like, if I ever had some little band that somebody gave a shit about something I did, I would only hope and strive to be like those artists that did that for me. And like now it's harder for me because after almost dying with COVID in 2020, I can't hang out. I don't feel comfortable doing it anymore because again, I still take precautions.
Yes.
But I am the guy that in spirit always loves doing that. I would be the person who would always sit at our merch table and sell stuff every night and do whatever and sign anything, take photos of anything. But like, I really do that because I love when artists do that for me. So thanks for saying that. I appreciate it.
Of course. And on that note, thank you again for being a musician's musician. So you may have noticed that ended maybe a little abruptly. That's because Kristopher and I ended up talking for about another hour, and just kind of rambled on and on. We went talking about the Replacements. We got talking about stuff that he had in his house, really cool stuff that he's collecting. We were talking about jazz. We talked about Mingus. We talked about... we just kind of went on and on and on. And so if you want to hear the rest of it, the whole dang thing, I do have that up on YouTube, and you can watch it, you can listen to it. And yeah, it's just all up there. So until next time, thanks so much. And here is the entirety of the theme song.
They just don't play the hits. But when you know how the sausage is made, you know how good this stuff is. It shouldn't take respect for the craft to sort out a good melody. But a musician's musician is here to keep musicians company. So long to gold records, here's a gold star. Some credit to show you how talented you are. So long to chart stoppers, for some